Forget the epic movies and the graphic novels. The version of Sparta you know is a Hollywood fantasy. The real Sparta, the one history often forgets to mention, was infinitely more bizarre. This was a society that used intentionally useless iron bars as money, kicked off marriages with literal abductions, and considered getting whipped for a piece of cheese a respectable coming-of-age ceremony. Today, we're not talking about their bravery. We're counting down 44 reasons why the most disciplined society in history was also the most spectacularly absurd. 1. Alright, so Sparta's economic policy was apparently invented by someone who lost a bet. To stop people from getting rich, which they saw as a character flaw, they used giant, heavy iron rods as cash. I'm not kidding, it's like paying for your morning coffee with a piece of rebar. But wait, it gets dumber. To make absolutely sure these things were worthless as actual metal, they'd heat them up cherry red and then plunge them into vinegar. This process made the iron so brittle and useless you couldn't even make a decent paperweight out of it. Imagine trying to use a vending machine. You'd need a forklift. This wasn't a currency, it was a full-body workout and a science experiment in how to make something as inconvenient as physically possible. 2. Forget the bachelor. Spartan dating was a full-contact sport that started with a crime. To get married, a guy would literally just go and abduct his chosen bride. No dinner, no flowers, just, "You're with me now." Then, her friends would prep her for the wedding night by shaving her head completely bald, dressing her in a man's cloak, and leaving her in a dark room. The groom then had to sneak out of his military barracks, find his bald, cross-dressing bride in the pitch black, and then sneak back before anyone noticed. This whole process is less romantic and more like a bizarre prank you'd pull on a college roommate. And you thought your Tinder dates were awkward. 3. You know how in movies the army always charges forward with a massive, terrifying scream? The Spartans looked at that and went, "Nah, that's too much effort. Let's do something way creepier." They would march into battle in perfect lockstep formation in absolute dead silence. The only sound was the eerie, high-pitched tune from a couple of guys playing flutes. It's like being attacked by a murderous, heavily armed marching band that only knows one weird, spooky song. It was pure psychological warfare. Their enemies were expecting a bar fight and instead got a silent, terrifying ballet of death moving towards them. That's way scarier than any amount of yelling. 4. In Sparta, staying single wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was basically illegal. If you were a man who hadn't gotten married, the state treated you like a public nuisance. During festivals, they would force you to parade around the main square completely naked, in the middle of winter. As if that's not humiliating enough, you also had to sing sad songs you wrote yourself about how you're a total loser for not having a wife. This is a level of government overreach that is just breathtaking. It's like if the DMV also managed your dating profile and punished you for being single with mandatory, freezing public karaoke. 5. Forget Boy Scouts. The most elite Spartan teenagers got to join a special club called the Cryptia, which was less of a club and more of a state-sponsored, teenage-run secret police force. Their main job was to keep the massive slave population, the Helots, terrified. And the final exam for these kids was absolutely insane. They were sent into the countryside at night with a knife and told to murder any Helot they could find. I'm not making this up. It was a graduation requirement. It's like if your high school final was a mix of survival training and becoming a horror movie villain. 6. If you were ever invited to dinner in Sparta, you'd want to lose the invitation. Their most famous, celebrated national dish was a nightmare called melas zomos, or black broth. The recipe sounds like it was created by someone who had only ever heard about food, but never actually tasted it. You take some boiled pig's legs, add salt and vinegar, and then dump in a horrifying amount of pig's blood. It was so legendarily disgusting that one out-of-towner who tried it said, "Now I understand why Spartans don't fear death." That's not a compliment. That's the most polite way of saying he'd rather die than eat a second spoonful. 7. Most governments settle for one leader at a time. Sparta, in its infinite wisdom, decided to have two kings simultaneously. from two different families who were in constant competition. It's like running a company with two CEOs who hate each other's guts and are actively trying to sabotage one another. This system was a built-in machine for creating drama. One king would propose a plan, and the other would probably oppose it out of pure spite. It's a miracle they ever agreed on what to have for lunch, let alone how to run a country. It was a government designed to be a permanent, dysfunctional family reunion. 8. If you were ever on a home renovation show in Sparta, it would be a very short episode. To prevent anyone from getting too comfortable or showing off, they had a law that said your house's roof could only be built using an axe, and your doors could only be made with a saw. That's it. No other tools allowed. This ensured that every single house looked like it was put together by a very angry beaver. Nothing was straight, nothing was smooth, and your front door probably had a 2-inch gap on all sides. It wasn't about building a home, it was about building a box that was just barely good enough to keep most of the rain out. 9. Okay, forget the SATs or final exams. The ultimate graduation ceremony for a Spartan boy was a combination of a game show, a religious service, and a trip to the emergency room. Here's the setup. You place a bunch of cheeses on a temple altar. The goal for the teenage boys is to steal the cheese. The catch? While you're trying to grab the dairy, a bunch of older guys are flogging you relentlessly with whips. This isn't a light tapping, it's a full-on bloody chaotic mess. And the grand prize for enduring this brutal whipping and successfully stealing the prize isn't a crown or a medal, it's cheese. Just cheese. It's the most violent and painful grocery run in human history, all for the glory of not crying while being beaten for a block of feta. 10. The Spartans were so terrified of new ideas that they basically put their entire country on lockdown for centuries. They were convinced that if their citizens traveled abroad, they might get infected with dangerous foreign concepts like art, philosophy, or, God forbid, a comfortable chair. It was a national policy of extreme paranoia. To enforce this, they not only forbade their own people from leaving, but they would periodically conduct a mass expulsion of any foreigners living there. It's like they thought a different opinion was a contagious disease. Imagine the panic. Sir, we've caught a traveler from Athens trying to tell a joke. Quarantine him before he spreads humor to the population. They built a society that was basically a giant self-imposed bubble against anything interesting. 11. In Sparta, getting your own named tombstone was harder than getting into Harvard. You couldn't just die of old age or a random illness and expect a participation trophy in the cemetery. There were only 2 ways to earn a named grave. For men, you had to die in combat. That's it. For women, you had to die during childbirth. As far as the state was concerned, these were the only 2 deaths that mattered. Everyone else who died, no matter how good a person they were, was chucked into an unmarked grave. It's the most brutally efficient HR department in history. So, how did he die? Fighting off 10 Persians? Excellent. Give him the deluxe tombstone. He choked on an olive? Sorry, that's not on the approved list. Put him in the pit. 12. If you think dating apps are weird, you'll love Sparta's approach to matchmaking. Young Spartan girls received an education that was just as physically demanding as the boys, and they were expected to show off their athletic skills. They did this by exercising and competing in public festivals, completely naked. This wasn't seen as scandalous. It was a state-sponsored audition for marriage. The idea was to show potential husbands just how healthy and strong you were. It's like the NFL Combine, but instead of a football contract, the prize was a husband. Men would just stand there, watching the javelin competition like they were scouting for a fantasy sports team. Look at the form on that one. She'll definitely produce strong warriors. Its romance boiled down to pure, awkward, athletic performance. 13. The most legendary story of Spartan toughness is also a strong contender for the stupidest story of all time. So, a young Spartan boy steals a live fox, probably because he was hungry. Suddenly, he sees his teachers approaching. Panicked, he does the logical thing and shoves the live, angry fox under his cloak. To avoid the shame of being caught as a thief, he stands there, completely silent and without flinching, as the trapped animal claws and bites his stomach to shreds. eventually killing him. He was celebrated as a hero, not for being smart, but for choosing a gruesome, agonizing death over having to admit he was bad at stealing. It's the ultimate example of winning a Darwin Award to prove a point. 14. You might think the two kings ran the show in Sparta, but the real power was held by a council called the Gerousia. This was essentially a board of directors made up of 28 guys who all had to be at least 60 years old. These weren't your average grandfathers who spend their days gardening. These were men who had survived decades of brutal training, constant warfare, and a diet of blood soup. And they served for life. This council was the supreme court and could even put the kings on trial. It was a government run by the toughest, most perpetually unimpressed old men on the planet. Imagine trying to argue a point with a guy who wrestled wolves for fun in his youth. Your proposal for a new tax code was not going to faze him. 15. In a society obsessed with courage, being a coward was the worst possible crime. If a Spartan soldier fled from battle and managed to survive, his life became a walking parade of shame. The punishments were creative, but the most visible one was the beard. He was forced to shave only one side of his face, leaving him with a permanent half-beard. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was a living billboard that screamed, "I am a coward who ran away." He had to walk around town looking completely ridiculous, a constant reminder of his disgrace. You can't just blend in when you look like you lost a fight with a lawnmower. It was a simple yet psychologically devastating way to enforce the "no running away" rule. 16. The Spartans viewed having children as a state project, not a personal matter. Their approach to genetics was cold, calculated, and deeply weird. For example, if an older man had a young, healthy wife, it was considered his patriotic duty to find a younger, stronger, more handsome warrior to be the biological father of his children. The resulting baby was still considered the legal heir of the older husband. It wasn't about love or romance. It was a bizarre eugenics program designed to breed premium-grade babies for the army. It's like creating a fantasy league for reproduction. "All right, honey, you're on the bench this season. I'm bringing in Leonidas from the front lines. He's got great stats." 17. You could literally be kicked out of Spartan society for being too poor to afford dinner. Being a Spartan citizen came with a mandatory membership to a communal dining club called a Sicician. This wasn't just a fun social gathering, it was a high-stakes potluck. Every single month, each man had to contribute a precise amount of barley, wine, cheese, and figs from his own land. If you hit hard times and couldn't pay your monthly dues, that was it. No excuses. You were stripped of your citizenship, kicked out of the club, and became a social outcast. Imagine getting your passport revoked because you couldn't afford to bring a cheese plate to the neighborhood barbecue. It was the world's most exclusive dinner party with a brutally simple guest list: pay up or get out. 18. The Spartans used their slaves in the most messed up, scared straight program imaginable to teach their kids about the evils of alcohol. To show children why getting drunk was bad, they would force Helot slaves to drink massive quantities of strong, unmixed wine until they were completely incoherent and stumbling around. Then, they would drag these humiliated men into the public dining halls for the kids to watch. The slaves would be forced to sing ridiculous songs and make fools of themselves, serving as a live-action, deeply degrading PSA. It's like if your health class involved watching a real person suffer just to prove a point. It's an incredibly twisted and cruel way to teach a lesson about moderation. 19. The entire legal and social framework of Sparta was forbidden from ever being written down. Their legendary lawgiver, a guy named Lycurgus, commanded that none of his laws should be recorded on paper or stone. He had this idea that the laws shouldn't be in a book, but should be built into the very character and daily habits of the citizens. This means one of the most rigid and complex societies in history was operating entirely on memory and tradition. It's like running a multi-billion-dollar corporation without an employee handbook. What's the rule about stealing cheese while being whipped? I don't know, ask Steve. I think his grandfather told him. It's a miracle the whole thing didn't collapse into a giant game of historical telephone. 20. The very first woman to ever win an event at the ancient Olympic Games was a Spartan. In a world where women were barred from even watching the games, let alone competing, a wealthy and ridiculously determined Spartan princess named Cniska found a loophole. The rule said women couldn't compete, but it didn't say they couldn't own and train horses for the most prestigious event of all, the four-horse chariot race. So in 396 BC, she entered her team, and it won. She technically became an Olympic champion without ever setting foot on the field. You have to admire the sheer audacity. She basically rules-lawyered her way into the history books and shattered one of the ancient world's biggest glass ceilings from the comfort of the VIP box. 21. The Spartan government had a built-in system that legally required officials to insult their kings once a month. A group of 5 elected officials, known as the Ephors, held immense power, even more than the 2 kings. Every month, they would meet with the kings to renew their oaths of loyalty. But this meeting wasn't just a formality. The Ephors used this time to officially criticize, reprimand, and basically tell the kings everything they were doing wrong. It was a constitutional requirement to keep the king's egos in check. Imagine if a president had a mandatory monthly meeting where a committee just roasted him for an hour. It was a system designed to constantly remind the most powerful men in the country that they weren't above the law. 22. A legitimate and recognized way to propose marriage in much of ancient Greece, including Sparta, was to just throw an apple at a woman. I'm not making this up. If you were a young man who fancied a particular girl, you could skip the poetry and just chuck a piece of fruit in her direction. It was a surprisingly direct approach. If she caught the apple, it meant she accepted your proposal. If she dodged it or let it drop, well, you just got very publicly rejected by fruit. It's a high-risk, high-reward system. On one hand, it's efficient. On the other hand, you better have a good arm and she better have good reflexes. Or your romantic gesture ends with a bruised forehead and a lot of public embarrassment. 23. Spartan warriors believed that having long hair made them more terrifying in battle. Unlike the clean-cut Roman soldiers, the elite Spartan fighters grew their hair long and took meticulous care of it. They thought it made them look taller, more fearsome, and more like lions. Before a major battle, in a bizarrely calm and unnerving ritual, these warriors would be seen sitting around, carefully combing and styling their long, flowing hair. Imagine the scene. You're about to engage in a life-or-death struggle and the guys across the field are busy braiding each other's hair. It was a serene and deeply intimidating preparation for absolute carnage, like a spa day before a massacre. 24. The Spartan state was so obsessed with physical fitness that they enforced a ban on getting fat with mandatory nude inspections. Your body wasn't your own business. It was a piece of state-owned military hardware, and you had to maintain it. Periodically, all male citizens had to strip down for a public inspection. If the officials found you were getting a little soft or overweight, you were publicly shamed and punished. There was no body positivity movement in Sparta. It was more like a state-run fat-shaming club. It's one thing to want to stay in shape, but it's another level entirely when your government can fine you for having a gut. 25. Spartan women ended up owning almost half the country by accident, which is the most Spartan thing ever. The men were so obsessed with their tough guy lifestyle, living in barracks, eating blood soup, and constantly marching off to war, that they were never actually home. They basically created a society where the men's only job was to be professional action figures. While they were busy doing that, the women were running the farms, managing the finances, and, thanks to Spartan inheritance laws, collecting all the property. By the end, women owned somewhere around 40% of all the land. It's the ultimate historical irony. The most macho, testosterone-fueled society in Greece accidentally created the wealthiest and most powerful group of women in the ancient world. They built a patriarchy so extreme, it circled back around and became a matriarchy of landlords. 26. The Spartans' first test for a newborn baby was to give it a wine bath, which is just a spectacularly bad idea on every level. Right after birth, instead of using water, they'd wash the infant in pure, unmixed wine. Their science was that a weak or sickly baby would have a seizure and die from the alcohol, while a strong baby would somehow just get stronger. This wasn't just a quick dip, it was their official quality control check. Welcome to the world, kid. Your first experience will be a hangover. It's a parenting strategy that seems to have been invented by a college fraternity. You have to wonder how many perfectly healthy babies failed this test simply because, they were babies being bathed in alcohol. 27. The Spartans intentionally designed their shields to be too heavy to run away with because they valued bravery over basic common sense. Their main shield, the hoplon, was a massive bronze dish weighing up to 30 pounds. It wasn't just a piece of defensive equipment. It was a commitment device. The design philosophy was simple. Make it so big and clumsy that trying to flee a battle while carrying it would be like trying to escape a bear while dragging a manhole cover. This is where their famous motto, "Come back with your shield, or on it," comes from. Dropping your shield was the ultimate sign of cowardice. They didn't trust you to be brave, they just made being a coward incredibly inconvenient. 28. Public mockery was a required course in the Spartan educational system. At the mandatory communal dinners, it was standard practice for the older men to single out young boys and verbally roast them. They'd ask them impossible questions and then viciously make fun of their answers in front of everyone. This wasn't seen as bullying, it was considered character building. It was like an open mic night, where you're the unwilling comedian and the entire audience is made up of cranky grandfathers who think you're an idiot. "Hey you boy, what is the meaning of honor? Wrong, and your posture is terrible." The goal was to develop mental toughness and sharp wit, but it probably just developed a deep-seated fear of dinner parties. 29. The entire Spartan system was a demographic time bomb that they built themselves. Their society was so obsessed with creating perfect warriors that they engineered their own extinction. Let's count the ways. They may have thrown imperfect babies off a cliff, their men were constantly dying in endless wars. Their marriage rituals were bizarrely complicated, and you could lose your citizenship for being too poor for the potluck dinner. This obsession with quality completely wrecked their quantity. The number of full Spartan citizens crashed from around 9,000 in their prime to just a few hundred. They were like a super exclusive club that was so picky about its members that it eventually had no members left. 30. The women of Sparta once had to defend the entire city by themselves, and they were awesome at it. In 272 BC, an enemy army showed up at their gates while the main Spartan army was away. Instead of panicking or evacuating, the Spartan women flat out refused to leave. They organized themselves into work crews and spent all night digging massive defensive trenches in front of the city. According to some sources, they even took up arms and stood on the walls to fight. Their incredible bravery shamed the handful of men who had been left behind into mounting a proper defense. It's like the city was saved by a highly motivated and extremely angry construction crew that your enemies were not prepared for. 31. For a full Spartan citizen, there was only one acceptable job title: soldier. That's it. You were legally forbidden from having a real job. You couldn't be a merchant, a craftsman, a farmer, or an artist. All that stuff was considered beneath you and was work for the lower classes or foreigners. A Spartan's resume was the shortest document in the ancient world. It just had one entry: professional warrior, lifelong. It's a society where your only career path is to fight until you die, and your retirement plan is getting a tombstone for dying correctly. They weren't just a warrior society, they were a society where any other ambition was literally against the law. 32. To make their state-sponsored murder program totally legal, the Spartan government officially declared war on its own slaves every single year. This is some next-level bureaucratic evil. So, to give their teenage death squad, the Cryptia, the legal green light to go out and kill helots, the government would perform a bizarre annual ritual where they formally declared war on their entire slave population. This turned a random murder in a field into a legitimate act of war. It's a terrifyingly clever and horrifying legal fiction. It's like your HR department creating a loophole that says it's not firing someone, it's just initiating a surprise career transition event, but with way more murder. 33. Spartan boys in training were given exactly one item of clothing for the entire year, a single red cloak. That was it. Your whole wardrobe was one cloak, for summer, for winter, for sleeping, for fighting. This wasn't a fashion statement, it was a policy of state-enforced discomfort. Can you imagine the smell? A teenage boy, after a full year of exercising, sweating, and sleeping in the dirt, wearing the same unwashed piece of fabric. That cloak wasn't just clothing, it was a walking biohazard. There was no laundry day. It was a belief that being permanently cold, itchy, and smelly would make you tougher. It probably just made you the least huggable person in the ancient world. 34. The Spartans were the undisputed ancient masters of the sarcastic one-liner. They hated long, flowery speeches so much that they perfected a style of blunt, witty comebacks known as laconic wit. This was basically the art of ending a conversation before the other person knew what hit them. The most famous example is when a massive Persian army demanded they surrender their weapons. King Leonidas didn't give a big speech, he just replied, "Molen lob," which basically means, "Come and get them." It's the most badass historical version of, "Come at me, bro." Imagine these guys in a modern customer service call. "Sir, could you describe the problem in detail?" "It's broken." "Could you elaborate?" "No." Click. 35. Being a king in Sparta wasn't just about leading armies. It meant you were also the country's chief superstition officer. The kings were the high priests, and they were responsible for a ton of religious duties, the most important of which was interpreting omens. This meant that a massive military invasion, planned for months, could be called off at the last second because a goat's liver looked a little squishy. Imagine King Leonidas, ready to lead his 300 warriors, having to say, "Sorry boys, pack it up. A bird just flew to the left, which is apparently very bad. Gary the pigeon says the universe is against us today. We'll try again tomorrow." The fate of their entire nation often rested on the digestive system of a farm animal. 36. In Sparta, if you failed at being a Spartan, you were officially demoted to a social class of inferiors. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. If you flunked out of the brutal training, showed cowardice, or went broke and couldn't pay your dinner club fees, you became a hypomenes. You were ethnically Spartan, but you lost all your rights. It's like your entire country unsubscribed from you. You were a walking, talking advertisement for failure. You lived in a social limbo, constantly reminded that you didn't make the cut. It's like being forced to wear a jersey for the team that cut you for the rest of your life. It was a brilliant way to motivate people through pure, unadulterated shame. 37. The Spartans were such masters of political spin that they used a massive earthquake as pro-war propaganda. In 464 BC, a catastrophic earthquake leveled Sparta, and the terrified Helot slaves decided this was the perfect moment to revolt. Did the Spartan leadership see this as a tragic natural disaster? Of course not. They immediately spun the story and declared that the earthquake was divine punishment from the gods, aimed directly at the Helots for even thinking about rebelling. It takes a special level of audacity to be standing in the ruins of your own city and have the main takeaway be, "See, this is your fault." They used a geological event as an excuse for an even more brutal and violent crackdown. 38. The entire Spartan way of life was built on a foundation of pure, pants-wetting paranoia. The Helot slave population outnumbered the Spartan citizens by a massive margin, maybe as much as 10-1. As a result, the Spartans lived in a constant state of terror that they were just one bad day away from a massive slave uprising that would wipe them off the map. Their whole society, the brutal training, the secret police, the one cloak rule, it was all just the most elaborate and over-the-top home security system in history. They were the original preppers, but instead of a bunker in the backyard, they built an entire civilization based on the paranoid assumption that everyone was out to get them. And to be fair, they were probably right. 39. For the Spartans, sports were not a game. They were just war with slightly fewer casualties. There was no concept of sportsmanship or "it's how you play the game that counts." The only thing that counted was brutally dominating your opponent. Running and jumping weren't for fun. They were to practice chasing down enemies. Wrestling was just fighting someone without your spear. A discus throw wasn't an elegant athletic display. It was practice for throwing something heavy at someone's head. Imagine a Spartan Little League game. There are no orange slices after the game. There are no participation trophies. There's just winning, losing, and a lot of crying kids being told to be tougher by their dads. 40. The toughest warriors in ancient Greece could be forced to abandon a military campaign because of an owl. The Spartans were ridiculously superstitious. They were constantly looking for signs from the gods in everything, and they took bad omens very seriously. An eclipse, a sneeze at the wrong moment, or an owl hooting could be interpreted as a sign of divine disapproval. A general who ignored such an omen could be put on trial for impiety. So you could have an entire army, armed to the teeth and ready for battle, being told to turn around and go home because a general heard a hoot and got spooked. They weren't afraid of dying in battle, but they were terrified of a grumpy owl. 41. The women in Sparta had a festival where their main event was to publicly sing songs insulting all the unmarried men. This wasn't just some lighthearted teasing. It was a formal, ritualized public shaming set to music. While some songs praised brave warriors, others were specifically written to mock and ridicule any man who was still a bachelor. Imagine you're just trying to enjoy the local festival, and suddenly a full choir of women points directly at you and starts singing a catchy tune about how you're a disgrace to your family and will die alone. It's like being the subject of a diss track performed by the entire town's female population. It's a level of peer pressure that is both terrifying and honestly kind of impressive. 42. After Sparta lost all its military power, it became a grotesque Roman tourist attraction, like a historical theme park from hell. Wealthy Romans, who were obsessed with the old legend of Spartan toughness, would travel there to watch staged, commercialized versions of their ancient, brutal rituals. The main event for these tourists was the diamastagosis, the cheese-stealing ceremony. They would pay good money to sit in stands and watch local Spartan boys get flogged bloody at an altar. What was once a sacred, if insane, rite of passage had become tourist entertainment. It's the ancient world's equivalent of turning a sacred burial ground into a cheap dinner theater. Sparta went from being the most feared city in Greece to its most pathetic piece of historical clickbait. 43. A Spartan king once tried to start a full-blown communist revolution to save the country, and it went about as well as you'd expect. By the 3rd century BC, Sparta was on the verge of total collapse because they had run out of citizens. So, a reformist king named Agis IV came up with a radical plan. He wanted to cancel all debts and redistribute all the land equally among the few remaining citizens, and even some non-citizens, to create a bigger, stronger citizen body. He was basically trying to hit the factory reset button on their entire economy. The wealthy elite, who quite liked having all the land and money, responded by having him promptly arrested and executed. It's the shortest and most predictable story of political reform ever. 44. The Spartans perfected a battlefield tactic that was basically the military version of psych, you thought. This deadly maneuver was the feigned retreat. In the middle of a battle, a section of their perfectly disciplined phalanx would suddenly appear to break and run away in a total panic. The enemy, smelling blood and thinking they had won, would break their own formation to chase them down. And just as the enemy line turned into a disorganized mob, the Spartans would suddenly stop, turn around, reform their shield wall instantly, and slaughter their now trapped and confused opponents. It was a masterpiece of discipline and pure deception. It's the ultimate "look over there" trick, but with a lot more stabbing. So, Sparta wasn't conquered by a superior army. It crumbled under the weight of its own bizarre and self-destructive rules. Their fanatical obsession with creating the perfect warrior ultimately created a society too rigid and fragile to last. But let's make this personal. Here's a serious question for the comments. If you were forced to reintroduce one Spartan policy to fix modern society, which would it be? The brutal agoge training for all children, or the helot system of slave labor? Defend your horrifying choice below. If you enjoyed this historical roast, execute the like button and subscribe.